Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my kitchen here on the north side of Cork City. My name is Jonathan Evershed, and I am a postdoctoral research fellow currently in the Department of Government and Politics and the School of English at University College Cork. Obviously, it had been my intention to deliver this talk to you in person, but the coronavirus had other ideas. Circumstances being what they are, I'm grateful to the Lindenhall Library and to Jason Burke in particular for the invitation to share this talk with you digitally and virtually. And it's only a shame that I couldn't be with you all in person and in Belfast to deliver it. The constraints of a talk of this nature going online are such that we won't be able to have the kind of question and answer session that I would ideally like to have had at the end of this talk. And to that end, you'll see I've included my email address, and for those of you that are so inclined, my Twitter handle. Should there be anything you wish to follow up with me on, or to discuss, or to ask any questions on, or dare I say, challenge me on at the end of today's talk. I'm particularly happy to be in a position to give this talk for the Lindenhall Library, which during my time in Belfast, during which I undertook the research on which this particular talk and the book around which I'll be talking today is based. The Lindenhall Library was an invaluable resource, particularly its Northern Ireland political collection. So it's great to be able to give back in some small way. So I just wanted to record my thanks to the Lindenhall for being such an important resource and for finding ways to circumvent the particular challenges that the coronavirus has posed. As I say, I'm going to be talking today about my book, Ghosts of the Somme, Commemoration and Culture War in Northern Ireland, which was published in 2018 by the University of Notre Dame Press. For those of you that are interested, the University of Notre Dame Press is currently having a summer sale. So if there's something in this talk that you would like to pursue in greater depth and greater detail, it's all in the book, and I'll be flagging some of that as we go. For those of you kind of logging on or signing in, whatever it is that you're doing, for expecting a discussion or a presentation on military history, on the what's, whys and wherefores of the Battle of the Somme itself as it unfolded in 1916, and the role that the 36th Ulster Division played in that battle, or indeed other divisions, including the 16th Irish Division. I'm sorry you're going to be sorely disappointed. I'm not a historian, I'm not a military historian. I am a political anthropologist, and my primary interest and what I'm going to be talking about today is not so much the Battle of the Somme itself, casualty lists, medal records, service records of people that fought and died at the Battle of the Somme on the 1st or the 2nd of July in 1916. Now, what I'm going to be looking at and talking about today are the ways in which the Ulster Volunteers, the 36th Ulster Division, and the symbol of the Somme have really haunted the politics, have influenced the course of politics, have continued to make their mark on politics and political culture in Northern Ireland since the founding of the state in Northern Ireland in the 1920s. My work is on what we call in the trade social memory, how commemoration, what we claim to remember, and in many ways what we're talking about here is not really meaningfully memory at all. What we remember, what societies remember, how that interacts with and acts to shape politics and culture, and indeed how it is shaped by politics and culture. I'm interested in how commemoration interacts with and acts to shape politics and vice versa. I'm interested in how, in examining the politics of what societies claim to remember and what they forget. And I want to foreground my view that commemoration, what societies remember and how, is a political choice with political consequences. Commemoration is not really about the past in any meaningful way, in my view. It's much more about politics, culture, and society in the present. So that's a key idea I want you to carry with you for the next 20 minutes or so. And obviously, if you had come for a lecture on the military history of the Battle of the Somme, then here's your get out clause. You're welcome to sign, to check out at this stage. And obviously I'm not there, so I won't be able to tell if you do. So you're at complete liberty to do so. By way of illustration of what I'm talking about, when I argue that the ghosts of the Somme, as I've called them in my book, haunt the politics of Northern Ireland, I wanted to begin with a very visual representation of what it is that I'm talking about. I'd like to thank, there are a number of images throughout the presentation that I've drawn on from the excellent website Extramural Activity, who also provide a number of images throughout the book Ghosts of the Somme, including on the front cover. So I want to thank Extramural Activity and the work and flag the work that they do in documenting the cultural politics of Northern Ireland as it's expressed on its walls and in its murals. So I wanted to begin my talk today by looking at this image of a banner, very recent, recently appeared on walls and fences and so on throughout Northern Ireland in 2019, at the end of 2019. And I'm immediately struck by the background image there that Boris Johnson is juxtaposed on top of the image of the soldier at the Somme, the First World War soldier on the Western Front. We can also see their silhouettes in the bottom of the image. And for someone from my background, someone from, if you like, from Great Britain, the British mainland, so-called, this use of First World War imagery to make political claims in the present is certainly unusual, definitely noteworthy, and in my view, fascinatingly interesting. What does the Somme have to do with Brexit? This is a protest taking place in the context of Brexit and Boris Johnson's acquiescence to or agreement of a so-called new border in the Irish Sea, new customs and regulatory arrangements in the Irish Sea. And what does that have to do with the Battle of the Somme? What does this idea of betrayal have to do with the Battle of the Somme? What kinds of claims are Unionists and Loyalists making about the nature of the Brexit agreement arrived at by Boris Johnson, and it's being couched in terms of a betrayal? And what does that have to do with this image of the Somme soldier? That's, I think, a really intriguing question for someone coming to Northern Ireland politics from outside of Northern Ireland. How and why is the image of the First World War invited in this way to intrude into the politics of the present? How are the ghosts of the Somme, those figures of the men emerging from the trenches on the 1st of July in 1916, how and why are they being invited to intrude into a political conversation about tariffs and customs regulations, and a new, if you like, pseudo-constitutional arrangement between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. How and why is the symbol of the Somme and the ghosts of the 36th Ulster Division being evoked in this way? What kinds of political claims are these figures of the 36th Ulster Division being called on? What kind of claims are they being called on to support or to legitimise? And that's really the kind of motivating question for the book, The Ghosts of the Somme. It's about situating the way in which Ulster Unionism and Ulster Loyalism remembers or claims to remember the Battle of the Somme, and with what consequences, what impact on the political present, and vice versa. How does the political present impact on the way in which unionism and loyalism seeks to recall the sacrifice? And I'm using that word deliberately, and we'll unpack that a bit more over the course of the next 15 minutes or so. What does that say about contemporary unionism, contemporary loyalism, and what impact does that have on contemporary politics in Northern Ireland? There is, as we recall from my opening statement, no politically neutral commemoration. There is no politically neutral recalling of these figures of the 36th Ulster Division, the First World War soldier, on the 1st of July. Ghosts of the Somme is a study of Ulster Loyalist, Ulster Unionist and Ulster Loyalist commemoration during the so-called decade of centenaries, during which there's been a keen interest in exploring Ireland's contested history, and particularly this contested period between 1912 and 1922, 1923, during which a number of the key episodes in the founding of the two states on this island took place. The Battle of the Somme and, of course, the Easter Rising, kind of representing the kind of high points of two memorial trajectories, two sets, two event sequences that resulted ultimately in the creation of the two states on the island of Ireland. As I say, during this so-called decade of centenaries, there's been a real interest in exploring that contested history, and crucially in using commemoration of these episodes, and particularly of the First World War and of Irish service in the First World War, as a vehicle for reconciliation. So the image there of Enda Kenny and David Cameron, which now looks like it comes from a completely different political era, but it is important to remember that this was kind of less than 10 years ago. And more recently of Taoiseach Leo Varadkar laying a wreath there in Enniskillen, Cameron and Kenny laying wreaths at the Menin Gate during a visit to the First World War battlefields. This kind of use of commemoration to represent and attempt to reinforce a kind of reconciliation between Britain and Ireland, Britishness and Irishness, unionism and nationalism in Northern Ireland and on the island of Ireland and between Ireland and Great Britain. I've taken issue in the book with some of this kind of reconciliatory reorientation of commemoration of the First World War in general and the Battle of the Somme in particular during the decade of centenaries. This use of the First World War as a reconciliatory parable, I think, is actually quite problematic ethically and I think historically as well. It's not true as kind of a new mythology would have it that there was no orange and green in the trenches. That wasn't true. And even if it was true, I think it's strange that the second most bloody conflict and costly conflict in terms of lives lost in human history is seen to provide a kind of viable foundation to build a kind of new shared future. new set of relationships between Britain and Ireland, Unionists and Nationalists. I think a new peaceful set of relationships. I think that's a very weird undertaking, in my view. And I think it's also an undertaking that's kind of run out of road, as the recent kind of hashtag Black and Tans controversy revealed. I think the kind of reconciliatory wheels have kind of fallen off the commemorative bandwagon, if you like. Bit of a clumsy metaphor, but I'm not sure that this kind of reconciliatory approach to commemoration that I've critiqued in the book has kind of much longer left to run anyway. And the book's primary interest, as I say, has been against that background of the decade of centenaries, its reconciliatory approach to commemoration, and the kind of wider politics of British and Irish relations. Against that backdrop, the book and my research has taken a particular interest in how and why the Somme story, the symbol of the Somme, and the story of the roads to the Somme, the Ulster Covenant, through to the formation of the introduction of the Home Rule Bill, through to the signing of the Ulster Covenant, the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force, and then eventually the formation of the 36th Ulster Division and their sacrifice, that word again, on the 1st of July in 1916. How commemoration of that story has remained central to, if you like, Unionist and Loyalist experience and understanding of politics and culture and political culture in post-conflict Northern Ireland in the context of this so-called decade of centenaries. The decade of centenaries and that kind of trajectory I've talked about in terms of big-scale commemorations commemorating first the Ulster Covenant and then the formation of the UBF and finally the formation of the 36th Ulster Division and their sacrifice on the fields of outside of Thiepval at the Somme on the 1st of July. Those commemorations, the decade of centenaries more widely, has taken place against the backdrop of really deep political change in Northern Ireland, and indeed in the UK more widely, and on the island of Ireland more widely, and then in terms of the relationship between Britain and Ireland too. The early phase of my research took place in the context of the flag protests and the Twadell parade dispute, and it finished with the Brexit referendum and the Cash for Ash scandal and the collapse of Stormont. So this was the kind of political background, the backdrop against which the decade of centenaries in general and Loyalist and Unionist commemoration of that key event sequence that I was talking about took place. And what I sought to explore and what the book looks at is how the ghosts of the Somme were continuously invoked within that context by Unionists and Loyalists, and how commemoration of the road to the Somme, those events that I've talked about, spoke to these political upheavals. So I was interested, for example, in how and in why there were often at the flag protests that I witnessed as some of my first fieldwork experiences when I was doing the research for this book. You'd often see banners depicting the men of the 36th Ulster Division, for example, flying alongside Union flags at these protests. And I was interested in how that symbol of the Somme, that image of the Somme, had kind of intruded into this this set of political questions that the flag protests were raising, and how they were being used to kind of bolster or buttress or reinforce the kinds of political claims that the flag protests were making. The Somme is the symbolic climax of what I, following Elisabetta Vigiani and Chris Brown, formerly of Linenhal's Parish, indeed, a curator at the Linenhall Library, have called Unionism's golden age. A period of communal militancy, of collective purpose, and of unity of purpose, and which in many ways flag protesters and other unionist and loyalist political actors during the decade of centenaries sought to emulate in some way. They sought to draw on that example and to emulate it, and claimed to be doing so through, again, use of the symbol of the Somme at those protests. For example, that symbol would appear elsewhere in other aspects of loyalist political culture, where they were making other kinds of claims, political cultural claims about the nature of those parades or events or what have you. The Somme is really the kind of pinnacle of that golden age, and represents the zenith, if you like, of the golden age. It provides the blood sacrifice, equal and opposite to that of the Easter Rising, on which the Northern Ireland state was founded in direct contradistinction to first the Free State and later, of course, the Irish Republic that would be founded in the 26 counties in the 1920s. The state of Northern Ireland was founded on the blood sacrifice of the Somme, which, as I say, represented the climax of this long-running trajectory that we can see represented here on this mural. That sacrifice, if you like, represented the founding promise of the state of Northern Ireland as a, if you like, a Protestant state for a covenanting people. Those that had signed the Ulster Covenant, many of whom, of course, went on to serve and indeed lose their lives on the battlefields of the Somme. That sacrifice came to be very powerfully symbolized in the Ulster Tower, which was the first battlefield memorial constructed on the former battlefields of the Western Front. We see it depicted here on this mural, and came to symbolize in a very concrete and material form the promise of, if you like, the promise that the Northern Ireland state then came to represent, which was that sacrifice was then for the creation of a place where the descendants of those who had fought and died on the Somme could feel safe and call home in a way that ultimately they were never able to do so, and not least because of serious issues in the governance of the Northern Ireland state from its foundation by the Ulster Unionist Party and so on. It's noteworthy, and you'll have noticed that many of the images I'm using in this presentation, many of the images, the depictions of the Somme, that symbol of the Somme, is very masculine. The soldier on the First World War battlefield, and a kind of masculine ideal type that the Ulster Unionist Party, the Orange Order, and the other kind of pillars of the Northern Ireland state as it was founded in the 1920s were able to draw on to kind of depict the ideal citizen in Northern Ireland. So the symbol of the Somme was mobilized in very particular ways right from the beginning, right from the inception of the state of Northern Ireland, and would go on to play, you know, in some sense, a kind of certainly central, interesting, potentially pivotal role in the kind of the descent into the violence of the Troubles, and then eventually the emergence of Northern Ireland from the kind of dark days of the Troubles into the peace process. And I'll elaborate on that towards the end. Some commemorations, which are kind of multi-layered, contested, and complex, recall this sacrifice at the Somme, sometimes very literally, like in the image here on my right as I'm looking at it, of a reenactment of the Battle of the Somme that was in June in 2016 in Woodvale Park, where the Battle of the Somme was literally reenacted with reconstruction trenches, replica uniforms, and so on. And that sacrifice, as I say, is at the heart of the founding promise of the state of Northern Ireland, a promise that for various reasons, various contested and contentious reasons, has arguably never been fulfilled. I think this helps to explain the resurgence of the Somme's centrality to Unionist and Loyalist political culture during this period of profound political upheaval. There are other factors at play here too, why the Somme has kind of taken on new meaning and new significance during the decade of Centenaries. The growth of battlefield tourism, online resources for family historians, and the availability of cheap flights, which now feel like something of a distant memory, to be honest, but cheap flights that meant it was easier to get to the battlefields and visit them, for instance, means that the Somme has been able to take on a kind of resurgent meaning. And there's been a new and renewed interest in the Somme story in the lead up to its centenary. The symbol of the Somme has, in many instances, then overtaken other symbols of Protestant Unionist and Loyalist identity, including the Boyne. You see a trend whereby images of the Boyne that would have been very predominant in murals and other kinds of symbolic representations have kind of been, in some instances, usurped by the image of the Somme and the Somme soldier. As I say, this in the run-up to the centenary, there was something of a resurgence in Somme commemoration, which suggests that commemoration of the Battle of the Somme by Unionists and Loyalists has kind of ebbed and flowed across time. And that, again, bearing in mind that the way that things are commemorated is never politically neutral, this has been shaped by, this ebbing and flowing has been shaped by changes in the political climate. First, as I argued earlier, as Northern Ireland descended into conflict in the 60s, and then as the peace process emerged in the 1980s and 1990s. I argue, for instance, that and I've looked at and explored, for instance, how how First World War commemoration in general and of the Somme in particular was kind of central to the construction of an identity for the Ulster Volunteer Force as it emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, as well as in shaping its post-conflict transition. In many respects, kind of contemporary Somme culture, and for anyone who wants to explore this in further detail, the Linen Hall Library Political Collection contains, for instance, back copies of the UVF magazine Combat, which explores in very interesting ways through its letters pages and elsewhere the kind of changing use of the symbol. You can explore kind of the changing use of the symbol of the Somme over time as something that gave identity to the Ulster Volunteer Force during the conflict, and then also how that identity kind of changed and transformed and was mediated again through reference to the Somme into the kind of post-conflict, the peace process and the kind of post-conflict period. In many senses, contemporary Unionist and Loyalist Somme culture, commemorative culture around the Battle of the Somme, is rooted as much in the cages of Long Kesh as it is in the battlefields of the Western Front. And as I discuss in the book, I think its resurgence in the 1980s and the 1990s and into the 2000s can be traced to the beginnings of what's called on the cover of the book, an expression I didn't coin, one we're probably all familiar with, but the culture war, and with Drum Cree in particular, which began its life as a parade, as a Boyne parade, and not as a Somme parade. I'm sure there'll be those that want to dispute that, but there is archival evidence to support that claim that the transition from a Boyne parade to a Somme parade is, as I say, explored in more depth in the book itself, and is a really interesting marker of how the symbol of the Somme has been mobilized and used in interesting ways in politics, culture, and political culture by Unionists and Loyalists at different phases of the conflict, and then in the transition away from conflict in the 90s. As Northern Ireland's politics, to summarise, as Northern Ireland's politics have been transformed in the wake of the peace process, and more recently by the upheavals of Cash for Ash, the loss of unionism's majority in the Northern Ireland Assembly, the collapse of power sharing, and Brexit, which brings us back to that image of Boris Johnson and that particular invocation of the ghosts of the Somme to decry and to rail against the betrayal that the descendants of those ghosts of the Somme feel in the face of the particular set of arrangements that Boris Johnson agreed to on Brexit. The loss of unionism's majority, as I say, in Northern Ireland, the haunting of the Somme's ghosts has really continued to be a defining feature of Northern Ireland's politics from its very foundation in the 1920s. But the messages that these ghosts have carried with them have not always been the same. And what role these ghosts will come to play in a new politics that's shaped by Brexit, that's shaped by coronavirus, by constitutional change across these islands, in the context of the upcoming centenary of partition also kind of remains to be seen. On that note, I wanted to end with a reading from Ghosts of the Somme. This comes right at the end of the book, so I suppose spoiler alert for anyone that's been intrigued and potentially wants to explore it in more detail, in what I've said in more detail in the book. But I'm just going to read the final couple of passages, or read from the final couple of passages in the book to try and kind of evoke some of what I'm trying to say here. Already likely to be more highly charged, upcoming centenaries, including of partition, will surely be likely more fraught in the current political climate. The centenary of partition, of the founding of the Northern Irish state in 2021, is surely going to take on an enhanced significance for Ulster Unionists and Loyalists seeking to reassert their status as integral members of the Union, which is itself in a state of flux. The DUP has made the marking of this centenary a key policy commitment in subsequent elections. During our follow-up interview in 2017, William, who is an artist and someone who's followed and played a key role in observing Ulster Loyalist Somme culture over a number of years, and I discussed a recent project of his which had involved a visit to the Somme battlefields following the 1st of July ceremonials in 2016. His description of the experience was arresting and posed if not the centrally important question for unionism and loyalism and its politics of commemoration in the final years of the decade of centenaries. This is a quote. "It was grey and there was nobody there. You'd had this huge crowd on the 1st of July in 2016, and now there was nobody there. And suddenly it felt more real, you know, far, far more real than all the pomp and ceremony had felt. What has happened is the corporatization of the whole thing of commemoration. If you compare the poetry on the Ulster Tower to the poetry on Helen's Tower, on which the Ulster Tower was modelled. One is about Ulster's grief, which has kind of taken over from personal grief. It's a colder kind of thing, that. And I thought, we've had the Somme in 2016, now what's next? Will unionism and loyalism forget about it or move on from it? Or will it seek to continue with it? I think people will always come here to the Ulster Tower to remember, but things have changed. There's Brexit and the alterations there. Courage is required of loyalists at this moment. Courage was required of the men who came up these slopes with bayonets and guns. What's required now of unionism and loyalism? What is required now for the future? What is required now for a changed political world? Loyalist commemoration of the Somme may have reached its high point in July 2016, and the ghosts of the Somme may have enjoyed a little respite in the days and weeks following. But in a world transformed, loyalism and unionism's ghost dance will surely continue. What new forms and meanings will it manifest in an uncertain and unstable future? For now, only the ghosts of the Somme are given to know. So that brings to an end what I wanted to say. And thank you for bearing with me, assuming that you have. And just by way of flagging where you can read more about my work on Ulster Loyalist and Ulster Unionist commemorative culture and its politics, its interaction with politics across these islands. There's a couple of suggested links here, and as I said at the outset, my email address and Twitter handle, if that's your thing, are also on the first slide. And thanks again for your time, and if you have any comments or questions or indeed criticisms, I look forward to hearing them. Thanks very much again for your time.